Brilliant. Well, it's 2 o'clock, or just coming up to 2 o'clock. It is 2 o'clock now, and I am over the moon for what's your story for the afternoon session. I must say we're now going into the home straight now, aren't we? Coming up to 5 o'clock. And Natasha, I've got to do 20 of these in 2 days. I'm like, oh my god! So suddenly the realization of what's actually happening is kind of kicking in. But we're into the afternoon now, and I am so over the moon to welcome you, Natasha, to do this. Thank you so much for taking the time to do it. For anyone that doesn't know Natasha, she is a writer and an activist. She tours schools, colleges, universities, and events throughout the world, delivering talks as well as conducting research on mental health, body image, gender, and social equality. And I first came across Natasha when I was lucky enough to go along to the launch of Where's Your Head At, which aims to change the law to protect the mental health of all British workers. And I've got to be honest, I was blown away by the powerhouse that she was in terms of the work that you were doing, both on that day and obviously everything that you've done previously. And I would love to talk a little bit about that today. I'd love to talk a little bit about your experiences, and as I know that from when we started having these conversations, the role of, what's your story? It's about us sharing, at a time when our mental health is more democratized, prevalent than ever before. There's never been a more important moment to be talking about this stuff, and it's never had the opportunity, I think, to gain greater impact. So sharing stories from people who've been through this, and as well as their practical tips of what we can be doing, I think is going to be so powerful. So Natasha, welcome. Thank you so much for coming along.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And for anyone that doesn't know you, please could you share a little bit of your story, first of all, kind of, when we started off talking about this, kind of like, when was the point that you realized about your mental health? When was the point that, you had an experience of it? I believe, if I'm right in saying, it was right back when you were at school.
Kind of. So when I look back now with the knowledge that I have about mental health, I can recognize in retrospect that I first started having symptoms of having panic attacks when I was about 10. Right. But at the time, because nobody really spoke about mental health or understood it or even considered it as an option, I was misdiagnosed with all kinds of things. They thought I had asthma and allergies, and they kept giving me things like inhalers and antihistamines, and none of it was working. And then eventually, I think, because I learned to live alongside it, I wouldn't say manage it is the right word, but I just stopped complaining about it, essentially. So they stopped trying to fix it. And then it was only when I was in my late teens, when I went to university, I developed an eating disorder. And now I think that the eating disorder was a symptom of anxiety. It was a way for me to kind of express physically everything that was going on in my head. And of course, by that point, we'd come along in our awareness, but also I think eating disorders, there's a lot of problems in the way that they are portrayed in media, but there is a kind of greater awareness and understanding in the general public about them. So once I kind of came clean about that, about having an eating disorder, that's when I first started getting help. I mean, I originally went to my GP and was told that I wasn't thin enough to qualify for help for an eating disorder. Yeah, no, and it still happens. I mean, I must have been about 20, so it's nearly 20 years ago now. And yet still, a friend of mine, Hope Virgo, has a campaign called Dump the Scales. And the whole campaign was formed because this is still something that's happening. People are going to their GP. The first thing they're doing when they're saying, I've got this mental illness, I'm in emotional distress, is the GP is weighing them and trying to measure that emotional distress using BMI, which is so strange. I mean, BMI is a blood for any kind of health.
For anything.
Health. Yeah, exactly. But particularly mental health. So my first experience of asking for help wasn't particularly useful. But then it was about 3, maybe 4 years later that I kind of came clean to my friends and family. I think they knew something was wrong with me, but they didn't know precisely what it was. And I was able to get help fortunately. But then I sort of recovered from certainly the behavioral stuff around my eating disorder, but I still felt not right.
Yeah.
And I thought there's something else going on. And now I know that in mental health circles, they talk about this thing called your primary.
Right.
So like the classic example that's always given is, do you drink too much as a coping tool for depression? Or are you depressed because you're drinking too much and alcohol is a depressant? So is it addiction or is it depression? Because if we get the primary, the other one is a symptom, and that will go by itself. And I think anxiety was my primary.
Absolutely.
So I just treated the symptom, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So the upshot of all of that is that I didn't get a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder until I was 31. So it was a kind of a 21-year period there where I didn't know what was wrong with me.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'm so pleased that you said that, and I have to be careful here not to get too far into this space, because I don't know enough about it to talk about it well. But you know, from the small amount that I know, when it comes to that thing around primary, you know, and in particular, I suppose around the kind of addiction space, you know, certainly, I don't know if you've there's obviously a lot of books within this area. You know, the Catherine Gray books, you know, the Joy of Being Sober, The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober, or you have the brilliant book by Lisa, I can't remember her surname, Girl Walks Out of a Bar, about a not dissimilar kind of journey in New York, and a lady who was a lawyer at the time and obviously now is a highly published author. But for both of them, they talk a lot about how actually the anxiety was the challenge, and the consequence of that was drinking or whatever that addiction was. And isn't, you know, and how challenging that we have to go on such a long journey for that initial primary thing to have to be recognized, you know, in itself.
Well, also the other thing is that very few eating disorders or any other kind of mental health problem is clear cut.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you have bulimia, there's a very good chance that you're also drinking too much, that you're binging with alcohol as well as binging with food. But because the way that NHS mental health services are set up, they're very regimented, so they won't treat you. So if, for example, you're drinking more than I think it's more than 3 glasses of wine a night, they won't treat you for depression or anxiety or an eating disorder until you've stopped drinking. But if the reason that you're drinking is the other mental health condition, that's not helpful. And it's almost like a kind of computer says no type situation, where people are sort of ping-ponging between services and no one will accept responsibility for them.
Wow. So tell me then, I mean, obviously, to be in the situation that you are, to have gone through those experiences, you know, for you, you know, what was acknowledgement a big part of it for you? Was it, or having it acknowledged either by yourself or externally, that it was this thing, or was that an education piece? I'm trying to get to the heart of that.
There was no big eureka moment for me. I think my recovery has been a really incremental process, and it's still an ongoing thing, because so much of your mental health has to do with your environment, and your environment is constantly changing. So it's these kind of little adjustments. But I would say I've got lots of different tools in my toolkit now. So I know, for example, now that the weather is getting worse and the evenings are getting darker, that I have to spend more time on self-care. I have to go out whilst it's light and get some fresh air and some sunlight, because otherwise I know what will happen, because I've had that experience. But I think, I mean, for me, the thing that made me get help for my eating disorder is because it was my stepsister's 40th birthday, and she's 53 now, so this was a long time ago. But so one of the things that they don't tell you about binging and purging is that it can sort of dissolve your the lining of your esophagus and your stomach. So if you drink alcohol, you get drunk a lot quicker. And I was just in so much distress during that time. I barely remember a lot of it, but I turned up to her 40th birthday. She's a summer baby, so it was boiling hot. I immediately got on the wine in a kind of thirst quenchy way, and just completely spoiled her birthday. And my behavior was appalling. And I mean, I don't remember much of it, but just was all over the place. And I'm like, she'll never have another 40th birthday. And that was the moment where I was like, I'm starting to really impact the people around me now. I have to get help for this. So that was when I decided that to go and get private therapy, because I was on a waiting list at the time for NHS therapy, but it just wasn't happening fast enough. And then with my anxiety, I had CBT, which was helpful, but more for the behavioral elements, for stuff like panic attacks and things like that. For the thoughts, I've tried all kinds of different things. And so what I've done is I've sort of taken the things that worked from each of the things that I tried. So I tried a bit of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming. I also tried, I've forgotten what it's called, the one where you go back and revisit memories and you try and work out
regression therapy. EMDR.
EMDR. I think it's EMDR.
I've just started doing it, and it's like, and
it's weird, isn't it?
It's becoming one, and let's talk about this, because I hope that actually one of the things that we can do is when we're doing these sessions is kind of sharing different things with people that maybe they can even ask about, because I didn't even know anything about it. And it's basically, and I'm not going to get the whole name of it right, and unless you know, please tell me. But EMDR, it's basically about, and the reason that I looked into it is that having done quite a lot of talking therapies, in particular about some of my experiences, was that I knew that I'd had those talking therapies, and they hadn't necessarily really kind of got to the root of it. And for me, it felt much more like a trapped energy, as it were. And the beauty of the EMDR is that actually you go back into certain situations, and whilst we can't obviously change the hardwiring of our beliefs, actually what we can get really good at is thinking about things in different ways. And the EMDR, which is tapping at the same time, is something that helps your body kind of go through that. I found it incredibly powerful. Did you?
Yes. And I think another reason, and this is probably something you'll be able to relate to as well, is when you work in mental health yourself, very often when you're seeing a counsellor or having talking therapy, there's a disconnect, because what they say to you, there's like another part of you, the professional part, that you can never truly switch off, going, I'd say that. That's the advice I would give.
That's so true. It's so
you don't
true.
invest in the same way. And so you just need something that's a bit more visceral. It's to do with your kind of bodily reaction.
Or I'm going, that was a really good question. I remember that one.
It's so true.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, isn't it? And I don't mind sharing this, but for me, it was, experiences that I had in terms of growing up, and with a stepfather. And actually, within the space of an hour, I kind of had gone from this place of viewing something in one way to then actually being able to have a really different perception of it, which genuinely changed how I felt. And so for you, I mean, for me, then I'd say that thing had quite an impact on my anxiety levels, and is something I'm a little bit better at managing now. Is that similar for you?
Having 2 panic attacks a day and not doing much else, because they really take it out of you. Now I have about 2 a year. I mean, it's really a really rare occurrence now. So I have got much better at managing, but I have to say that definitely part of my recovery has been helping other people. And this is a really common thing.
Yes.
When you've gone through mental illness, people want to give back and invest. And I was very keen from the beginning that I didn't want to present myself as the scientist, but I did want to work in conjunction with scientists, because I wanted this to be a very kind of evidence-based thing, and not just about me and sharing my story, because that can get exhausting after a while. If you're doing 5 talks in a day and you have to talk about in depth about your experiences, but I've been going into schools, colleges, universities, events now for about 12 years.
Yeah.
And that the people that I've met, the conversations that I've had, and also just the sense of actually making a difference,
Yes.
I think has been the most important part of my recovery process, actually.
Can I ask you two questions then? Because that's really brought up a couple of things for me. So first and foremost, talking about the anxiety itself and talking about the management of it. Question to you: do you still feel those same things, those same feelings bubbling up, but then have the tools to manage them better, or do they not come in the first place?
They're still there, but I just recognize them for what they are now.
Yeah.
And so it's we go through our whole life being taught to trust our instincts, and that's a really good piece of advice. But the problem comes when you can't separate your instinct from the voice of your mental illness.
Oh my God, that's so, like, that is so true.
Yeah, so you got this voice in your head telling you. So for me, my anxiety doesn't manifest in the ways that perhaps people might expect. You know, I've got a radio show on, you know, live national radio. I've got no problem with public speaking. I go to Parliament. I tell off politicians. None of that phases me in the slightest.
I've seen that. I've seen that.
Yeah. But when I get really anxious is around things like worrying what people think of me. If somebody doesn't text me back, I'm very claustrophobic. Some days I'll sort of have a really paranoid, vivid fantasy about if I leave the house, I'm going to die. You know, it's the little things that other people don't struggle with. So I've got a sort of backwards brain in a way, because the things that are intimidating, I don't.
I'm really, 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 like, I can really associate with all of those things. It's really strange. Like it's yeah, I really get that. The big things faze me less than the little things.
Yeah. So I think there's two things. First of all, so I call them the washing machine thoughts that will go round and round and round. I've learned to give air to them so that I can see how ridiculous they are. So I'll either tell somebody or I'll write them down.
Right.
And that's my way of acknowledging the anxiety so that it knows that I've heard it and we can both move on.
Wow.
And then the other thing I do is that I have to have a kind of feel the fear and do it anyway mentality. So if I'm having a day where my brain's telling me that if I leave the house, I'll die.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, so I'm just going to get dressed. And I'll sort of bargain with myself. Okay, I'm just going to walk out. And I'll tell myself, you know, if you go out 5 minutes and you hate it, we can go back. But I have to sort of force myself into those experiences, because the great kind of irony is that all the things that are best for your mental health, like fresh air and exercise and connecting with people, they are the hardest things to do.
Yeah, when you feel like that, right?
Yeah,
that's, and I love that you just said that point about if it's too hard, we'll go back. And that for me just really summed up that whole thing of looking after yourself, like we're in this together, you know, that whole thing of actually, like, that you've got to make friends with yourself first of all, right? You've got to take care of yourself first of all, and that's been one of the things that's come out through all of the talks that I've been having. But you know, that yeah, I think that's really beautifully put. That kind of like, we'll go back if it's not okay. Can I talk to you a little bit? You picked up on one thing there, which I think I'd like to dig into a little bit more, because I think it's going to be something that most people relate to a lot. And if you don't, lucky you. You know, this whole thing about caring about what people think about you. You know, and I started off by saying at the conversation when I first met you, you know, the powerhouse that I thought you were, you know, and I have no idea that stuff's going on in your head. You know, and I said this earlier in another talk, I compare my inside with your outside. You know, how do you, for someone who, and it doesn't matter how accomplished I think you are, it doesn't matter how incredible I think you are, it's what's going on in your head. How do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis? You know, how do you manage that stuff, those voices? And let's talk more about the intuition, but the instinct bit later as well.
It's not so much what people think of me. I don't want to control what people think of me. What really bugs me is when I'm misquoted or lied about.
Okay.
And that is something that has happened to me a lot. First, I grew up in Essex, which is like where all the gossip in the whole of the UK comes from. And so it's, you know, people do, they spread rumors about you, and you know, something really innocuous becomes this massive thing. And it's like, but I didn't do that. I didn't say that.
Yeah.
And then sort of being a woman in the public eye, I think learning about how kind of trolls and vested interests on social media operate, how they're kind of willfully spreading misinformation about, particularly about liberal voices in the media, to try and create a kind of right-wing libertarian consensus, so that anybody who was searching my name on social media would think that everybody disagreed with me and hated me. That's, in its own way, it's a compliment, because it means that I'm perceived as a threat. You know, they've noticed me.
Yeah.
So I think looking at it that way helped. And then I just kind of, because I used to get stuck in and argue with people and go, and then I realized that they didn't want to be corrected. It wasn't that they genuinely misunderstood. It was that they will kind of modify their idea of you to whatever fits with their pre-existing belief system.
Oh my God, this is so true.
So it's a waste of time.
And do you know? And tomorrow we've got a guy on called Paul Mort, who, if you haven't heard of him, please look him up after this. He's brilliant. He's one of my. I've heard of him first as a coach. Saw him online, or saw some of his stuff across social media, and just loved it. And since then, actually, he's hopefully going to be doing some work with us, and blah blah blah. And he's on tomorrow. And he talks a lot about this, you know, he talks like every single day he's getting, you know, 20 plus abusive messages, you know, calling him the worst names in the world, calling out his family, blah, blah, blah. And he did this post on it saying, look, I'm human, right? I'm human. I get affected by this. But also I really genuinely realize that if I'm having that effect on someone, I'm triggering them because I'm doing something that they are not. Right. And that has to be at the heart of it, you know, and as you just beautifully put, it doesn't matter what you say. That's about them getting something off their chest rather than it having anything to do with you.
Yeah,
you know?
Because they have almost prototypes in their head. So they're like, oh, feminist. And the first feminist I ever met was like this. So she must be exactly the same. Or, you know, whatever it is. And you're triggering something in them. And actually, someone I worked with once said to me that social media is the closest you'll ever get to observing humans in a vacuum. You know, so it definitely says more about them. And I have had to work really hard on letting that go, because you know, if people don't like me, okay with that, actually, because you can't be everyone's cup of tea, and I am quite opinionated, and I can see how that would grate on people. But it's when people don't like a lie that's been told about me, I'm like, at least don't like me. Do you see what I mean?
Interesting. Yeah. But interesting though, that if that's obviously, you know, that was obviously one of the first things that you brought up, and that's obviously quite a core thing for you. But you're in a situation that embraces that, right? You're in a situation where that happens. You know, a lot of other people, a lot less strong people, would run the hell out of there, right? Would run away from that rather than maybe learning a coping mechanism of how to deal with it.
I guess it's, you know, I've always had what my mum says is a kind of overdeveloped sense of fairness. She said, you know, most children grow out of going, that's really unfair. And she was like, you never did. And then whenever someone would say to you, life's not fair, you'd go, but it should be.
Yeah.
And so I think it would be more painful for me to leave it.
That's and that then, you know, and I don't know if have you ever heard of the scarf model? So the scarf model is basically it's used quite a lot I've used it quite a lot in the coaching that I do, and basically it's used to kind of really look at the things that are really important to individuals. So you know, so there's 5 things that it's made up of. SCARF, which stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And actually each individual will have a different order for them. So actually for me, my biggest thing is around certainty. Like, you know, and I really like that. I'm really good dealing in black and white. Put me in the grey and I start shriveling. And, you know, and as well as then the relatedness bit and that connection. But it sounds actually that fairness is a very strong thing for you. And actually making sure that, you know, and I would imagine then that really drives your work, you know, that drives that's your energy for making sure that people are treated well.
Well, there's an unlimited pool of unfairness as well, which is the other problem.
You're always going to have a job. You're a genius.
No, because actually when I first started doing this job, the original idea came about because I didn't think that schools were getting their mental health lessons right. It was very much framed around mental illness rather than mental health.
Yeah.
I thought this, well, you know, it's important to awareness raise about mental illness, but unless you've been through it, you won't relate to it. So I thought, you know, we should be teaching people that everybody's got a brain, and we're all part of this conversation. And I thought what I'll do is I'll work with a few schools and I'll make some really banging PSHE lessons, and then I'll go and do something else. But the more I worked in education, the more I mixed with young people, the more I traveled around the country and then around the world, the more unfair things I uncovered. So every time I was sort of rolling up my sleeves and getting stuck in, and it's turned into a 12-year career.
Wow. And so your work, I know, has always been very focused on schools. Have you dipped your toe into organizations? Have you kind of, like, I know obviously with Where's Your Head At, I know that a lot of work there is in terms of actually how we, you know, making mental health work better within organizations, but have you actually gone into any of those organizations as well and delivered talks or workshops there?
As in
yes,
I have. So I actually created for Where's Your Head At it's all about how stress and anxiety actually shrink your synapses, so they stop you from being productive. And
absolutely.
in fact, an investment in reducing stress and anxiety in the workplace will pay dividends,
of course,
through staff productivity, less time taken off sick, also less presenteeism, so people just kind of showing up physically but they're not really there mentally. And what I have found is middle management, who are people my age, so people in their 30s and 40s generally, are really into it. The pushback is coming from the CEOs, the kind of top level management, which is people in their 50s and 60s. It's totally a generational thing. But it completely filters down. Like there was a piece of research that was done by Milk Round, who's a graduate recruitment agency, and they found that young people are leaving universities with really high levels of emotional literacy, very low levels of stigma around mental illness. Absolutely. As soon as they get into the workplace, that good work is being undone because of it's a structural thing. You know, the way that businesses are structured actually induces stigma.
Of course, because, you know, all of a sudden, you know, you come into a blame culture, you come into a failure culture, you come into this incredibly traditional way of working, which, by the way, is led by that CEO at the top who has a real discomfort around any of this stuff. And it, you know, and it sucks it out of it. Interestingly, so I've just had Hayley Melender on one of the sessions, who's just amazing. This incredible girl. If you've not met her, I know that you would love her. And she's 24, and she is out there, and she, having gone through, she basically talked about, so she suffered depression really seriously, having actually already started as a speaker and an advocate within the mental health space, and actually really kind of overworked herself when we were at university, suffered from severe depression. And she basically, over a period of time and throughout her recovery, and having actually tried to commit suicide, she then basically has, in her own words, turned her pain into purpose, and now goes and speaks at a lot of organizations. She was talking about being at the head office of Microsoft over in the US, you know, and the CEO of Microsoft, she's speaking at this speaking gig with all of these senior bods there, and saying to them, we don't need more role models, we need more real models. Like, we need people who are human. And it's terrifying how far away that seems to be in many instances.
I mean, the problem is anybody who rises to the top in the current structure, by definition, the way things are works for them. So they therefore have no incentive to change it. And you know, you can see that in education. where I, spend most of my time in schools and colleges and universities, the policymakers, the people who have reached government level, generally speaking, they went to Eton or similar, then to Oxbridge, and they ended up working for the government. So when you try and talk to them about people who had a different educational pathway,
they just don't get it.
Yeah, they've got no frame of reference for that, and therefore you never have change.
And moreover, I guess also, by their very definition, a lot of people within those positions are going to fit a similar mold, in terms of maybe that's a wildly sweeping statement, and I want to be very careful about what I say there. But in terms of maybe emotional intelligence, it's a rarer person that is very adept at that, in particular in those positions. If you looked at the psychometrics, one would wager that many of them follow a distinct type of person who may or may not buy into some of those more softer and more vulnerable skills, which I think is at the heart of some really great leadership. But
they would stop calling them soft skills, because
particularly
with the changing job market after COVID, being able to communicate, it's going to be the most important thing, being able to connect and communicate.
And do you know what? And so good point. Now the conversations that you're having, considering everything that you are doing within that mental health space, what do you think are some of the most important things that we could be doing now? I mean, for me now, I think what's bubbling up more often than not is around communication, and us all getting really, really good at communication. If we're not in front of each other, we have to get better at that. Is there anything you'd add to that?
So a really massive concern for me at the moment is radicalization, because people are isolated, because people are vulnerable. They are, I'm reading Laura Bates' book at the moment, Men Who Hate Women, and she's talking about how the manosphere, the so-called manosphere, is targeting boys as young as 11. And all you have to do is type in "what is feminism" into YouTube, and it will begin with, what's her face, who played Hermione in Harry Potter, talking in very simple terms about what feminism is. But then 4 or 5 videos down, you're into really kind of vitriolic, misogynistic stuff, telling these boys that, there's a feminist agenda and that they're the real victims, and that women are going to wrongly accuse them of sexual assault, and all of and the pay gap doesn't exist, all of this really horrible stuff. And I think at the heart of that, this is actually a mental health crisis, because the reason that these boys are attracted to that is because of where they are at psychologically. So for me, I think first we need to hold social media companies to account for what they're putting out there, but also in more mainstream media, stop giving platforms to people who they're almost like a gateway drug for.
And I do wonder, that for me, for all of the challenge that has come with COVID, we've seen with companies how, they fast forwarded 5, 10, 15, even 20 years in some instances. And I do wonder, with a modicum of hope, that whether or not similarly, this has become a very human crisis in, beyond the physical of just the disease itself. Actually it's brought to light so many human issues, that maybe were slightly under the surface before. People are suddenly more interested in the world around them and more acutely aware of what's going on within their own minds and how they're feeling and the things that affect them. And I wonder if that's really brought that out. I genuinely, Natasha, I would happily speak to you all day. I wonder, I've just seen one question on here before I wrap up, and I would love us to answer it, because I really would love us to help the question that's been put here. So UK Painters asks, any advice on how to stop having worrying thoughts? Do you want to answer that first, and then I can add into it afterwards?
So there's a kind of 3-part process that I go through. The first thing, as I said, is to air the thoughts. Professor Steve Peters, who wrote The Chimp Paradox, he calls this boxing your chimp. And he says, if you try and push those thoughts away, they'll shout louder because your brain thinks you haven't heard it. So I'll either write them down or I will verbalize them.
Yeah.
And what I like to do is I like to write them down in 3 separate lists, and I divide the things that are worrying me into things I can control, things which have a solution but I need someone else's help, and then things I have no control over whatsoever. And then sometimes I'll burn that third list in a kind of ceremonial
Wow, I love that.
And then with the other things, the things that are worrying me that I have a degree of control over, I like to sort of highlight them in different colors. So I have one color for urgent, one color for easy, and then I can tackle those things chunk by chunk. For me, I'm somebody who, I like to feel proactive. Yes. I like to feel like I'm doing something.
Me
so
too.
That is a very kind of empowering exercise for me, because it makes me feel like there are things actually that I can tackle, and that will make me feel a little bit better.
I love that. And, I think in particular at the moment, I come back to this place of uncertainty. Actually, if I can work out the bits that I can control, suddenly I do feel more in control of what's going on, rather than it feeling like this massive blur that's out there that I've got that is completely out of my control. I'd actually also add into that, and I talked about this earlier, the work of Byron Katie, where she talks a lot about asking, is it true? Actually, is this thought true? Is it genuinely, and interrogating, what's the evidence that I've got for this? What purpose does it serve for me? How does it make me feel? And where would my life be without it? And what could I think instead? I think that those are really useful tools to go through. And also, actually, funnily enough, a not dissimilar conversation when I was speaking to Helen Tupper this morning, and some beautiful things that came out for her. The asking, making sure that we don't make these things personal or pervasive or permanent. Thinking about how we can think about things in different ways. Natasha, thank you so much. It was, what a brilliant talk, and it's always really interesting when I'm doing these, like the interesting way in which they go, and I'm really, really proud of the stuff that we covered off there, because I think even within a short amount of time, I think we went quite deep into some stuff, really useful stuff, which I think a lot of tools that people will be able to take.
Hope so, yeah.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you. And thank you for your time. And thank you for being so honest as well. I think actually in being able to kind of go into the experiences that you've had, and talking a lot about how the important thing is about getting to that primary point. And I wonder if there is something, about giving people the space and the opportunity to talk about that stuff. It enables them to get to that, which hopefully is happening now, but certainly didn't for a long time. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I will look forward to speaking to you really soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.